Why cheap flights cost more in the long run, the trade-offs nobody explains. Cheap flights feel like a win. You search, you sort by lowest price, and there it is, a fare that looks dramatically cheaper than everything else on the screen. It feels efficient, smart, almost responsible. Why pay more for the same destination? The problem is that the price you see is not the cost you're agreeing to. It's the entry point to a series of trade-offs that quietly shift risk, responsibility, and flexibility from the airline onto you. None of this is explained clearly at booking, and most travelers don't realize what they've given up until something goes wrong. This isn't about being anti-budget. Cheap fares exist for a reason, and sometimes they work out just fine. But the long-term cost of cheap flights is rarely measured in dollars alone. It shows up later, in lost options, forced decisions, extra fees, wasted time, and stress that feels unnecessary only in hindsight. Welcome to Passport Pointers, where we break down the systems airlines don't explain so you can make decisions with your eyes open. Today, we're talking about why cheap flights often cost more in the long run, and the trade-offs nobody spells out when you click Purchase. Do us a small favor, hit that thumbs up and subscribe to Passport Pointers. We post weekly videos revealing travel secrets, tips, tricks, and hacks. We're also working on several how-to, step-by-step videos. Share in the comments what you'd like us to work on next. There's a lot on the horizon for 2026. Reason number 1, the price you see is not the price of the trip. The biggest misunderstanding around cheap flights is assuming the fare represents the full transaction. In reality, it's only the entry fee. What you're buying up front is a seat and a set of restrictions, not flexibility, not protection, and not peace of mind. Everything that makes travel resilient, the ability to choose, change, recover, or adapt when plans shift, is deliberately unbundled and sold later, usually at a premium. A cheap fare is not a discounted version of the same experience. It's a different product entirely. You're not getting the same flight for less. You're getting a tightly constrained version of the trip with fewer rights, fewer options, and stricter penalties. Seat selection costs extra. Carry-on access may cost extra. Same-day changes, schedule adjustments, or even basic customer support can suddenly come with price tags or hard limits. On a perfect travel day, that difference feels invisible. You board on time, sit where you're assigned, and arrive as planned. The cheap fare looks like a win. The real cost shows up when reality intervenes. A delay, a missed connection, a family issue, or a schedule change turns small restrictions into expensive obstacles. Fees stack, options vanish. Recovery becomes slower and more stressful. Airlines count on this gap between expectation and reality. Cheap fares sell because they look like savings, but they shift risk onto the passenger. You're paying less upfront by accepting more exposure later. By the time you account for add-ons, fees, and lost flexibility, the trip often costs more than a higher fare would have, just spread out in ways that are harder to see until it's too late. Reason number 2, cheap fares trade flexibility for certainty. One of the first things cheap tickets strip away is flexibility, even though that loss isn't obvious at checkout. Change options disappear. Cancellation rules tighten. Same-day adjustments become impossible or expensive. What looks like a simple fare difference is actually a shift in how much control you retain once the ticket is issued. In practice, cheap fares force certainty much earlier than most travelers realize. The moment you click purchase, you're locking in assumptions about timing, connections, personal schedules, and even health. If plans shift slightly, your ticket doesn't bend with them. A meeting runs long, a family obligation appears, or weather reroutes your first flight, and suddenly you're dealing with rigid rules instead of workable options. This rigidity also affects how you respond to new information. Maybe a better flight opens up later in the day, maybe a safer connection appears, maybe a delay makes an earlier departure smarter. With a cheap fare, those options exist only in theory. The ticket you bought was designed to discourage movement. Any adjustment usually comes with penalties that erase the original savings. Higher fares aren't just about comfort or perks. They buy optionality. They allow you to react instead of absorb. They create room to make better decisions as circumstances evolve. Cheap fares remove that safety net in exchange for a lower upfront number, transferring risk from the airline to the passenger. On smooth trips, that trade-off goes unnoticed. On imperfect ones, it becomes the most expensive part of the journey. Reason number 3. Cheap flights push decision-making downstream. Cheap flights feel simple because they postpone complexity. Instead of resolving key choices up front, they defer them. Seat selection, baggage, boarding order, and even basic airport logistics are left undecided at purchase, creating the illusion of savings while quietly scheduling decisions for later when the traveler has less control. At checkout, this feels harmless. You can decide seats later. You can add a bag if you need one. You can figure out boarding when the time comes. The problem is that airlines price certainty dynamically. The closer you get to departure, the more expensive stability becomes. Seat maps shrink. Preferred seats disappear. Overhead bin space tightens. Options narrow while prices rise. This pushes decision-making into worse conditions. Instead of choosing calmly at home, you're deciding while juggling schedules, weather alerts, and gate changes. The pressure isn't accidental. Airlines know that travelers under time constraints are more likely to pay to resolve uncertainty quickly. What looked optional becomes unavoidable. Downstream decisions also compound. A seat fee leads to a boarding upgrade to protect overhead space, which leads to a bag fee because the carry-on allowance changed. None of these costs feel large in isolation, but together they erase the original fare advantage. The cheap ticket didn't lower the cost of the trip. It redistributed it across moments of stress. The savings don't vanish dramatically. They leak away through small, constrained choices made when leverage is gone and flexibility is already spent. Reason number 4. Cheap fares shift risk from the airline to you. Higher priced tickets quietly include something most travelers never see listed at checkout: protection. That protection shows up when things go wrong. Miss a connection and there are more rebooking options. Face a delay and your ticket often carries higher priority in the recovery queue. Need to reroute around weather or mechanical issues, and the system has room to help you adjust without starting over. Cheap fares remove that buffer. When disruptions happen, the airline's obligation to help you is narrower and slower. Rebooking options are limited. Priority drops. Alternatives that would be available to other passengers may not be offered to you at all. The system still functions, but it functions around you instead of for you. This isn't punishment, it's design. Lower fares come with tighter rules and fewer guarantees because they transfer uncertainty away from the airline and onto the traveler. You're expected to absorb missed connections, long waits, and inconvenient reroutes with less support. If recovery requires flexibility or additional cost, that burden lands on you. The risk shift is easy to miss because it only activates during disruption. On a smooth travel day, everyone looks equal. On a broken one, fare class suddenly matters. Who gets rebooked first, who gets protected from cascading delays, and who is left waiting are all shaped by what you paid. You didn't just buy a cheaper seat, you agreed to carry more of the downside when the system fails. Reason number 5. Cheap flights reduce your margin for error. Margin is the invisible cushion that keeps small problems from turning into ruined days. Cheap flights remove much of that cushion. Tight connections, rigid rules, and limited rebooking options leave very little room for anything to go wrong. When the itinerary is built to be as efficient as possible on paper, it becomes fragile in real life. With a cheap fare, everything has to go right. Traffic must cooperate. Security lines must move. The first flight must arrive on time. If any step slips, there's often no acceptable alternative waiting. Later flights may be sold out. Fare rules may block changes, and standby options may be unavailable. What would be a minor inconvenience on a more flexible ticket becomes a major disruption. This lack of margin creates stress, even when nothing technically fails. You feel it during the connection. You feel it when the plane taxis slowly. You feel it when the gate agent pauses before making an announcement. Your brain is tracking risk constantly because it knows recovery options are thin. The trip becomes something you manage instead of something you experience. Airlines understand this trade-off. Cheap fares are optimized for efficiency, not resilience. They work best under perfect conditions. When reality intrudes, they unravel quickly. The stress isn't imaginary. It's your awareness that the itinerary has no slack. Cheap flights save money up front by removing margin, then charge you in anxiety and disruption when the system behaves like the system always does. Reason number 6. Cheap fares are designed to monetize regret. Airlines don't rely on cheap fares to make money on their own. They rely on what happens after you buy them. The low price is the hook. The real revenue comes from the moment you start second-guessing the decision you just made. Once the ticket is issued, the system begins offering ways to make the trip feel safer, smoother, or more tolerable. Seat selection appears first, framed as a small upgrade to avoid uncertainty. Then priority boarding, sold as protection for overhead bin space. Then baggage, flexibility, insurance, and change options. Each presented as optional, each quietly restoring something the cheap fare removed. This is not accidental. Cheap fares are designed to create controlled discomfort. Not enough to scare you away, but enough to trigger doubt. The airline knows that travelers don't like uncertainty once commitment has been made. After you've locked in dates and plans, you're far more willing to pay to reduce stress than you were at checkout. What's powerful about this model is how incremental it feels. Each add-on seems minor. $10 here, $20 there. None of it feels like a reversal until you look at the total and realize the fare no longer resembles the deal that attracted you. By then, you're not upgrading for luxury. You're buying back normalcy. Cheap fares work because regret is profitable. They convert anxiety into revenue by stripping away stability and then selling it back in pieces. The airline doesn't need every passenger to buy every add-on. It only needs enough people to feel uneasy enough to pay. Have you ever bought the cheapest flight and then slowly added things back until the price didn't feel cheap anymore? Share your experience in the comments. We read them all, and they help guide what we break down next. Reason number 7, cheap flights distort time costs. Money isn't the only currency in travel, but cheap fares treat it like the only one that matters. Time gets quietly devalued. Longer layovers, awkward departure hours, extra connections, and secondary airports are common trade-offs, and they're rarely framed as costs. On paper, the itinerary looks fine. In real life, it consumes far more of your day, your energy, and your patience. Cheap flights often push departures earlier and arrivals later, stretching a single travel day into an all-day event. A 6 a.m. departure means waking up in the middle of the night. A late-night arrival means lost sleep and a groggy first day at your destination. Add long layovers or multiple connections, and the trip stops being about where you're going and starts being about enduring the journey. Time costs compound in subtle ways. Long connections keep you in airports longer, standing, waiting, and spending. Extra legs increase the chance of delays, missed connections, and baggage issues. Inconvenient airports add ground travel time that isn't reflected in the ticket price at all. What looked cheap at checkout quietly absorbs hours you never planned to give. When you factor in time honestly, many cheap flights stop looking like bargains. They ask for more of your day, more of your energy, and more of your trip than you expected. The price was lower, but the cost was higher. Cheap fares don't eliminate expense. They just convert it from dollars into hours, and those are often harder to get back. Reason number 8, cheap fares limit your ability to say no. One of the least discussed costs of cheap flights is how effectively they remove your ability to decline bad options later. Once you commit to a restrictive fare, your negotiating power shrinks. When something goes wrong, the choices presented to you may be inconvenient, uncomfortable, or inefficient, but they're often the only ones available under your ticket rules. Disruptions reveal this quickly. A missed connection leads to a reroute with an overnight layover. A cancellation pushes you onto a flight at an awkward hour. A delay forces a tight connection you wouldn't normally choose. You're offered solutions, but they aren't really options. Declining them can mean waiting days, losing the ticket's value, or paying significant fees to regain flexibility. The trap isn't that airlines force you into bad outcomes. It's that cheap fares remove the leverage required to push back. More flexible tickets allow you to wait, reroute, or choose alternatives without penalty. They give you the freedom to say, "That doesn't work," and expect a better answer. Cheap fares narrow that conversation to take it or leave it. This loss of agency creates stress even before problems arise. You know that if something breaks, your ability to respond is limited. Decisions feel heavier because the consequences of saying no are higher. Cheap fares don't just reduce comfort, they reduce choice. And when travel goes sideways, the ability to say no is often the most valuable option you can have. Reason number 9, cheap flights encourage false comparisons. Booking platforms are designed to make cheap flights look smarter than they are by stripping away context. Prices are shown side by side, but trade-offs are not. You see dollar amounts lined up neatly, while differences in flexibility, timing, recovery options, and downstream costs are buried behind clicks, footnotes, or not shown at all. The comparison feels clean, but it isn't complete. A $120 fare looks objectively better than a $190 fare when price is the only visible variable. What's missing is what that extra $70 actually buys. Better departure times that don't steal sleep. Fewer connections that reduce failure points. Seats you can choose without fees. Change options that don't punish you for adjusting plans. When those elements are invisible, the cheaper option appears rational, even when it's not. This framing nudges travelers toward decisions that optimize for checkout, not for the full journey. The platform rewards price sensitivity and minimizes everything else. By the time the trip unfolds, the comparison has already done its work. You're locked in, discovering trade-offs only after they matter. False comparisons also distort memory. When the trip becomes stressful or expensive later, it feels like bad luck instead of predictable outcome. The original decision seems smart because it was presented that way. The cost didn't disappear. It was deferred and reframed. Cheap flights win comparisons because the comparison itself is incomplete. When price is isolated and context is hidden, travelers are guided toward options that look efficient in the moment and feel expensive in hindsight. The platform didn't lie. It just didn't show the whole picture. Reason number 10. Cheap fares make you do more work. With a cheap ticket, the airline offloads responsibility onto you. You become the system manager, tracking rules, restrictions, and deadlines that higher fares quietly handle in the background. You monitor schedule changes, watch seat maps, calculate baggage fees, and double-check boarding rules because the ticket itself no longer cushions mistakes. This creates a hidden workload before the trip even begins. You research fare conditions. You read fine print. You set alerts in case something changes. During travel, that work intensifies. You watch connection times more closely. You listen harder for announcements. You worry about overhead bin space, gate changes, and whether a small misstep will trigger fees or lost options. The trip becomes something you actively manage instead of something that unfolds with support. That mental effort has a real cost. Cognitive load drains energy just like physical strain does. By the time you arrive, you may feel more tired than the distance alone would justify, not because travel was difficult, but because vigilance never stopped. You are constantly avoiding errors the ticket wouldn't forgive. Higher fares reduce that burden. They absorb complexity so you don't have to. Rules are looser. Recovery is easier. You're allowed to make reasonable adjustments without penalty. Cheap fares remove that margin and replace it with responsibility. The flight may cost less financially, but it costs more attention, and attention is finite. When too much of it is spent managing the system, there's less left to enjoy the reason you traveled in the first place. Reason number 11, cheap flights turn small issues into big problems. On a flexible ticket, most travel problems stay small. A short delay is annoying but manageable. A missed connection triggers automatic rebooking. A schedule change creates options instead of pressure. Cheap fares remove that safety net, which is why ordinary disruptions feel disproportionate when you're traveling on one. With a cheap ticket, recovery options narrow quickly. A delayed flight isn't just late, it threatens the entire itinerary. Miss a connection and you may be offered one inconvenient alternative, or none at all. Rebooking can mean paying more than the original fare, waiting hours or days, or accepting routes you never would have chosen intentionally. The system still works, but it offers fewer ways out. This forces bigger decisions under worse conditions. You're tired, standing in line, and under time pressure, yet you're weighing whether to spend more money, gamble on standby, or abandon part of the plan. What should be a minor adjustment becomes a high-stakes choice because the ticket doesn't allow graceful recovery. The amplification effect is what makes cheap fares so stressful. They don't create more problems, but they magnify the consequences of normal ones. Weather happens, aircraft need maintenance, air traffic control slows things down. On flexible fares, those realities are absorbed. On cheap fares, they're passed directly to you. Cheap flights feel affordable until something breaks. When it does, the lack of margin turns routine travel friction into a crisis you're forced to solve on your own. Reason number 12. Cheap fares change how airlines treat your priority. When disruptions happen, airlines don't respond to passengers equally. They triage. That triage is driven by fare rules, flexibility, and customer value over time. Passengers holding higher fare classes, flexible tickets, or elite status are often addressed first, not because airlines favor them personally, but because their tickets allow faster, broader recovery. Cheap fares sit at the opposite end of that hierarchy. The rules attached to those tickets restrict what agents can offer. rebooking options are narrower. Priority drops. Even when alternatives exist, the system may not surface them for lower fare classes without additional payment. It can feel like being overlooked, but it's really a function of the constraints built into the ticket. This difference becomes obvious during delays and cancellations. Some passengers are rebooked automatically, while others wait in long lines. Some receive proactive notifications with options, while others must ask repeatedly or wait for inventory to open. The outcome isn't random. It's governed by what the ticket permits the airline to do. Understanding this dynamic changes how disruptions look from the outside. It explains why certain travelers seem to glide through chaos, while others struggle to regain footing. The system isn't reacting to people. It's reacting to fare rules. Cheap fares don't just lower upfront cost. They lower your operational priority when the airline has to make trade-offs. That's not a moral judgment. It's a structural one built into how modern airline pricing works. Reason number 13. Cheap flights can cost you opportunity. Opportunity cost is the value of what you give up when you choose one option over another, and cheap flights quietly create a lot of it. They often lock you into awkward schedules, inconvenient airports, or rigid timing that limits what you can realistically do before, during, or after the trip. Those constraints don't show up as fees, but they still extract value. A bargain fare might require an early departure that wipes out a full workday, or a late arrival that costs you the first night of a short trip. It may force you into a secondary airport far from where you actually need to be, adding ground travel that crowds out meetings, rest, or leisure. Because the ticket is restrictive, adjusting the plan to reclaim that lost time may be expensive or impossible. Opportunity cost also appears when better options emerge later. A more convenient flight opens up. A schedule changes. A meeting shifts. With a flexible fare, you can adapt and capture that value. With a cheap fare, you're often stuck, watching better choices pass by because your ticket can't move without penalty. These losses are easy to dismiss because they aren't itemized. There's no line on the receipt for missed conversations, shortened experiences, or days that felt rushed instead of rewarding. But over time, they accumulate. Trips feel tighter, less productive, and less enjoyable than they should. Cheap flights save money by narrowing possibility. When you account for what you give up, the true cost often isn't financial at all. It's the opportunities you never got to take. So why do cheap flights still exist? Because they work for airlines and for some travelers. Cheap fares fill seats, attract price-sensitive customers, and generate revenue through add-ons. For travelers with flexible schedules, high tolerance for uncertainty, and minimal downstream needs, cheap flights can be a good deal. The problem is assuming they're a good deal for everyone. Cheap flights aren't bad, they're conditional. How to think about cheap flights more accurately. Instead of asking, is this the cheapest option? A better question is, what am I giving up for this price? Look at flexibility, timing, recovery options, and add-ons as part of the real cost. Decide whether the trade-offs align with how important the trip is and how much uncertainty you can absorb. The goal isn't to avoid cheap flights, it's to choose them intentionally. What this means for your future trips. Once you understand the trade-offs, cheap flights stop feeling like a gamble and start feeling like a tool, one you use when the conditions are right. You recognize when paying a little more buys you fewer decisions later. You see flexibility as insurance, not luxury. And you stop being surprised when the cheapest option turns out to be the most expensive in the long run. If you want more Passport Pointers breakdowns that explain the hidden trade-offs behind airline pricing and travel decisions, watch the next video that's popping up on your screen right now. Thanks for watching Passport Pointers, and I'll see you in the next video.